So welcome to the big news about Canada's biggest churches, our virtual press conference. What you're hearing and seeing will be recorded, and the link will be posted at leadnet.org/Canada. I'm Warren Bird, a research director at Leadership Network, and Leadership Network, if you're not aware, is a nonprofit formed in 1984 that fosters innovation movements that activate the church to greater impact. Our website, leadnet.org. And I'm co-hosted today by...
My name is Joel Thiessen. I am Associate Professor of Sociology at Ambrose University in Calgary, Alberta, and I'm a sociologist of religion. I study religion and culture in Canada, and as you see there, my book that's just off the press, The Meaning of Sunday, The Practice of Belief in a Secular Age. So we'll talk a little bit about that later on as well.
We're also joined by our two report sponsors. If you didn't see their ads on the very back page of the report, please do so. Deeks Insurance, we'll hear a quick word from them later on, and PushPay, eChurch Giving, we'll have a quick word from them. So let's jump into a quick overview of the report. Maybe it's just American benefit, but to put context, if Canada is roughly a tenth of America's population, it doesn't divide down religiously the way the United States does, in that in Canada, Catholics are a larger group than Protestants, 13 million versus 9 million, and therefore the number of Protestant churches is proportionately smaller, estimated at 18,000 Protestant churches across Canada. And so how many of those are really large churches that we define as attendances of 1,000 and higher? It's 150 Canadian churches, which to everybody I've talked to, I'm the only American who was involved in the study, they're like, wow, there were that many large churches in Canada. So as we go to the next slide, Joel, anything to add about this one?
No, nothing to add there, Warren.
All right, so as you might suspect, and this next graph shows, that the larger the church, the fewer they are. So of the large churches that were in our survey, 63% were in the 1,000 to 1999 attendance range. Now again, this is attendance. This is noses on a weekend worship, not what's on the membership roll, not Christmas and Easter, but on a typical weekend's worship. And if they're multi-site, which the larger the church, the more likely it is to be multi-site, all physical campuses combined. So Canada's churches range, largest churches that we studied, from 1,000 on a weekend to almost 10,000 on a weekend. Joel?
Nope, sounds good. Nothing to add there, Warren. Here we see on the next slide, we wanted to tap into what is the source of growth for people who are attending some of the larger churches, and you see the distinction here between transfer growth, and we're able to tap into those differences between those who transfer from another church within the same city or location, as well as those who have moved into a new city, who are attending a church perhaps in their former location and now are looking for a church in their new location. So here we find that 40% of those source of the growth comes from transfer. Of course, people have children, raise them within their own context, and so this contributes to about a third of those who are associated with larger churches. And then on the right-hand side, conversion. I think what's really helpful and interesting here is this distinction between new believers who don't necessarily have either any faith background or who come from another religious tradition, and those who have renewed their faith of sorts, and capturing those distinctions. And perhaps even one of the more surprising findings in the study, that upwards of a third of those who are tied to larger churches come via conversion. Anything, Warren, to add there?
Yeah, let me just add that these numbers and percentages are self-reported by one person in the church. So we didn't poll all 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 people in the church and say, you know, tell us about your spiritual journey. We ask one representative in the church, what's your sense of where your people come from? So not able to be independently corroborated, but interesting numbers nonetheless.
Yeah, and in that vein, as we heard from leaders across the country, asking them what are the different things that are fueling growth within your context, I'll maybe just briefly touch on the top four here. And children's or youth ministry, a strong vision and mission, the passion and personality of our senior leader, pastor, and emphasis on worship and music. If you look at the literature on congregations that are flourishing, and I'm part of a research group looking at flourishing congregations across Canada, this very much aligns with what we know from the literature of having a vibrant youth ministry, of having charismatic, dynamic leaders who can engage their congregation in relevant ways and who can communicate a vision and mission, and then an emphasis on contemporary music and worship that engages those in their congregation too. Warren?
Great. You may notice that the numbers that left don't add up to 100, and that's why, because we said to them, choose up to 3 of the most important factors in fueling your growth, and so that's why you had those high numbers. Now, we then drilled down further and said, so talk to us about the most effective outreach, and we gave a bunch of options there. And not surprisingly, children's and family youth ministries that impact the parents was the #1 listed growth factor. #2, the Alpha Course, which originated in the United Kingdom. It's a small group discussion series of faith issues. Does evil exist, and things like that, that helps people address questions and also helps them connect with each other. It's done in a small group context, often over pasta. Then events with evangelistic appeal, missional community groups, which would be small groups with a particular outreach focus, and so forth. So this helped us understand, okay, what explains how these large churches grow, at least from their perspective. Joel?
Yeah, I'd maybe add to that. It'll be intriguing looking forward on this Alpha Course question, given that 1 in 4 Canadian adults and 1 in 3 Canadian teenagers say they have no religion. And how will churches appropriate and respond to this growth of the no religion category, and what role might the Alpha Course play into it? So it's something that we're definitely paying attention to moving forward. One of the other questions that we explored on the next slide is the quality of ministry and how the leaders evaluate what are the different things that they think they can do are advantageous in having a large church. And as you look through this list, starting with the most often cited at the top and working its way down, that it really is a one-stop shop of sorts, the Walmart of churches, if you will. The sense that they can provide greater breadth and depth of programming, of facilities, of finances that they don't necessarily assume can be provided in a smaller setting. And so there is this sense of bringing all these variables together that add to the breadth and depth of the ministry, programmatic, and financial offerings in large church settings. Warren?
Great. Well, in just a minute, we'd like to field live questions, which you're able to type in at any moment. So a reminder to put some in, and we've collected also questions that people phrased earlier. Just before we do, we want to introduce and welcome our 2 sponsors. Again, they had a full back page ad each, and so be sure and look at that as you look at the report. Deeks Insurance Services. We have the president, Danny Deeks. And Danny, what is the welcome, and what is the Evangelical Group Insurance Plan? That's a mouthful, but it's something you specialize for Christians and churches.
Yeah, thank you, Warren. Thanks for allowing us to be a part of this in a small way. These are exciting times for the church in Canada. Deeks Insurance introduced the Evangelical Group Insurance Plan to the marketplace in 2005 to take advantage of group or collective purchasing power of church members in Canada as it relates to their personal home and auto insurance needs. We felt that the general traditional insurance rates did not adequately recognize the behavioral patterns and purchasing habits of church members, adherents, and pastors in Canada. So this program has now grown to include over 40 denominations and is underwritten by one of the largest insurance companies in Canada. So we're excited about where God has us and where He's taking us, and certainly appreciate being involved here today.
Super. And our other sponsor is PushPay, new to Canada. Derek Gillette is on the line. Let me give you two questions in one, Derek. First, this is a large church report. Does PushPay just specialize in large churches? And also, what % of PushPay giving is mobile versus online?
Yes. So the slide you see in front of you there gave a little bit of a spoiler to your question. PushPay serves all church sizes. We know that most churches fall into that 0 to 300 category. And so you see that over 55% of the churches we serve are in that category. The biggest thing for us when we were building this software is to make it accessible both from a price standpoint and a technology standpoint to churches of any size. So whatever size you are, we've got a solution that fits for you. And the really exciting thing for us is that we see 80% of our non-recurring giving come through a mobile device, which is pretty exciting because that means that the device that people have on them at any time throughout the week, the smartphone, is something that they can now use to give simply to your church.
Wow, great. Thank you, Danny Deeks and Derek Gillette of Deeks Insurance and PushPay. So let's jump into the questions. Joel, why don't you field the first couple? And these were ones that came in advance, so we've got them up on the screen, and we'll read the questions and then do our best to give a short answer.
All right, question one. I'm wondering about transfer growth, 23%. It feels like good news for the large churches and not so good news for medium and small congregations in the same area who might be losing congregants. Can you tell us a bit more about that? I guess in brief, the reality is that you do see some transfer growth with some of the larger congregations that are perceived as that one-stop shop. But there's also this sense, given people's different religious preferences, etc., that have all kinds of preferences for small versus large, for different styles of music, etc., that it's not an inevitable reality, but it is probably a reality within different contexts across the country, whether rural or urban, but isn't an inevitably reality. And we see some of the other sources of growth, as noted earlier as well, that comes from conversion and within, but it's part of the narrative as well, for sure. I don't know, Warren, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, Reginald Bibby, one of the scholars that participated in this, University of Lethbridge, had historically written some articles about the circulation of the saints, the recirculation of the saints, pointing out that Christians have a lot more transfer growth than they ought to have. And so this is acknowledging a reality. There is some transfer growth, and the churches tend to prefer the conversion growth, but it doesn't always happen that way.
Yeah. All right, looking to the next question. How does this challenge how scholars view religion in Canada? In my book, The Meaning of Sunday, one of the general conclusions, and based on a series of data, is that Canada is highly secular and is moving in a secular direction. And so when you see this report on large churches, does it challenge this secular narrative? And I would say that it doesn't necessarily challenge it. I think secularization is the overarching narrative, but this is a story within the story. And if we focus solely on secularization, you miss the fact and reality that there are large churches. There is a sense that they are growing under certain conditions and contexts, etc., and that it's not necessarily an either or, but it's both and happening simultaneously. I don't think we should necessarily assume that large churches are the future of religion in Canada, or that it altogether bucks the trend of secularization, but it is a very important narrative within the religious and secular landscape in the Canadian context.
And again, I think this is a big surprise for many, that there are so many large churches, and that they are growing, and that they are across the provinces, and that they are increasing in number. and that they are led by a wide range of pastors, so it's not just an older boomer thing that's gonna was a blip and is disappearing. And if there's any parallel to the United States, which is my specialty of research large churches, it's a trend that's going to continue to grow. Let's take a look at the next question. Will you be releasing the names of the churches that participated? No, because we promised everyone anonymity. Or will you be giving a top 10 list of the biggest attendance churches in Canada? Not at this time, but from the report are going to spin off all kinds of specialty reports. We ask questions of ethnicity and gender and origins. Was your pastor born in Canada, or were your pastor's parents from Canada? And we just have a fascinating array of ministry and demographics and other things, at which point I'm sure there will be a permissioned release of which are the top 10 churches in Canada. Joel, the next question, what was the biggest surprise to each of you in the findings? What were you most surprised at?
I would say the most surprising thing is the discussion on conversion and the idea that churches are fairly active in trying to evangelize people, and in the perception that upwards of a third of those who are attending large churches come via conversion. And I'm still actually, to be honest, not sure what to make of that. Academically, it stands as a bit of an outlier in some ways from some other studies, but it definitely was the most surprising to me.
If you find multi-ethnicity, that there is no race that is 80% or more are multi-ethnic, and that's way ahead of U.S. churches. Now, we know as a general rule, the larger the church, the more multi-ethnic it tends to become. But 62%, yes, it represents that Canada is a multi-ethnic society, but it also represents that multi-ethnicity has become part of church life as well.
Yeah.
Next question. What do you think these large Canadian churches, why do you think these large Canadian churches have been so underreported to date?
World, you talk about secularization, and so we focus on that, and so it's not really a focal point. And there's probably this perception that the big church is the U.S. phenomena, but not so much in Canada. And I think because of that, there hasn't been any sort of a lot of discussion of that, and there hasn't been any significant research. I mean, this really is the first study of its kind to try to ask these kinds of questions and get answers, and hopefully it will generate greater levels of reporting on this phenomena and deepen and broaden our understanding as well.
Great. Next question, someone in Kelowna. Now let me impress you with, as a non-Canadian, in the Okanagan Valley.
Very good, Warren.
That wants to know, where are these large churches typically located? And the report gives you stats on page 3 of the report. Let me just read that line. The most are in Ontario, 37%, followed by Alberta, 29%, British Columbia, 18%, Manitoba and Saskatchewan tied at 6%, and then Quebec, 4%. And that generally corresponds with the population in the provinces, with Ontario the largest and so forth, except Quebec, which has fewer evangelical churches, the lowest overall church attendance, and that's the most predominantly Catholic community.